So we should get cracking with this evening. We've got a lot to pack into tonight's episode about Shakespeare's mum and dad. So those of you who perhaps are new to, he was a very naughty boy, Elizabeth, yes. Those of you who are new to the format, over the next 8 weeks, over these 8 weeks, we are going to be looking at various aspects of Will's life at home before he goes to the theatre, and we've split them down into different episodes. And this week we are looking at his mum and dad and the and that family history, his grandparents, his parents, their rise and their fall in civic life. And we're also going to ask why, when there is no record of his birth, we've given the 23rd of April as the day for his birthday. On to that. So, who were these Shakespeares? Who were they? Well, Michael Wood, I've mentioned him last week, in his book, In Search of Shakespeare. He does a brilliant job bringing to life the Shakespeare ancestry. And he concludes that the string of a family originated in the ancient forest of Arden. Now, this was a huge swathe of Warwickshire, northwest Warwickshire. About 35% of that area would, in the Domesday Book, it's recorded as covering 35% of that sort of northwest area of Warwickshire. And sometime around the 1300s, in the village of Balsall, the son of Adam of Aldwych is rewarded with some land given to him by Edward III for good work done in the 100 Years' War. And in that moment, Adam of Aldwych changes his name to a more military-sounding surname, Shakespeare, shaking his spear at the French over in France during the 100 Years' War. Now, skip on another 200 years, and there are loads of Shakespeares all over this area: Packwood, Knoll, Wilmcote, Baddesley, Wroxall, and the Packwood Shakespeares. They become business partners of Will's grandfather, a chap called Ralph Holinshed. Now he goes on and writes the Chronicles of English History, which is basically the blueprint that Shakespeare uses to write all his history plays. He actually passes away in 1580 while staying with the Packwoods. So, it's a very interesting thing. Did Shakespeare ever go to visit the Packwoods and maybe met Ralph Holinshed or saw a copy of that famous book? Who knows? But as we start to talk about Will's family, we must remember that Elizabethan families were a little bit different to what we know or we think families are today. Elizabethans had a much wider, stronger sense of family, and they were much more local. So those loyalties and those values were remembered across generations. People married within families, cousins, and so forth. And it's a theme that runs throughout Shakespeare's life, this mingled web of people that continually turn up on deeds for houses or trusts or legal documents, or people he buys land off or sells land to. And so these names continually crop up. Godparents were seen as incredibly important people in the lives of their godchildren, and second to their parents. And so Hamlet and Judith Sadler, who become Shakespeare's godparents, turn up constantly on various documents, as do their children. Now, in the 1520s, Will's paternal grandfather is a chap called Richard Shakespeare, and he owns a farm of about 80 acres, and he's leased it at a place called Snitterfield, which he farmed for about 35 years. He's got two sons, Henry and John, and now Henry remains a farmer, while John, he's a bit more of a Elizabethan Renaissance man. He decides to put farming to one side, and he goes to town to seek his fortune. And he apprentices himself to a glover, a man called Dixon. Now, an apprenticeship is for 7 years, so it's a pretty long process. And he also, once he becomes a glover in his own right, is also referred to as a whittower, which is basically also someone who prepares the hides and the leather for making gloves into. So not only was he making gloves, he was also, in certain respects, at the very start of the gloving process with the fleeces and removing the leather from them and so on. A very smelly, dirty business, which we'll come on to in a moment. But this sense of breaking with convention for John too is is um, is something that Shakespeare, I like to think, sort of inherits in his father, striking out into a new commercial world, because that decision by John, it will be a decision that will place his family at the heart of civic life, and it will give his son access to an education and the arts in a much broader sense than just being the Morris dances in the village square. Now, the first record we have of John, in fact, isn't a brilliant one. It is in 1552, and he is being fined. Bit of a theme recurring here for the Shakespeare's. Um, and he's being fined for leaving a dung heap. Now, a dung heap, this isn't human excrement or animal excrement or anything like that, but this is the waste products from gloving. So those terribly smelly, yucky hides, which would have been boiled and left out to dry, and so on and so forth. This is a heap that's stuck behind his house, basically, or in the front of the street. It's all the offcuts, leather and rubbish and things like that. But it's not the first time that John is going to have a brush with the law, and it will come back in about 20 years' time, and we'll catch up with him this evening. But at this point in his life, he's doing pretty well. 4 years later, in 1556, he is appointed one of the town council's two chief ale and bread tasters. Now, there's a pretty good job. It's a job that's recorded as being one for discreet men. So I don't know quite what that would entail. You've got to be discreet about it. 2 years later, though, in 1558, he is appointed as one of 4 constables, depriving single men of weapons. And later in the year, he's also an assessor of fines at the court leets. Now, the court leet, basically, these were a little bit like bawdy courts, sort of small offences were heard in the court leets. So he's rising through the ranks, the civic ranks, very quickly. On the 2nd of October, 1561, he will be sworn in as one of 2 chamberlains on the town council. The chamberlains, they're in charge of the borough's property, and they're in charge of the finances as well. So by 1561, John is one of just 28 men responsible for the running of Stratford. It's a huge responsibility and a very quick rise in fortunes. And he'll be involved with civic duties for the next 20 years of his life. And as we shall see, he will grow in social standing because of it. But let's backtrack a little bit just for a second. 5 years. On the 7th of June, 1556, we have the first mention of John as a glover. And his gloving business is clearly doing pretty well, because in that same year, he purchases not only an estate with a garden and a croft in Greenhill Street. A croft is like a small thatched, thus expanding his business. But he also purchases 2 separate but adjoining properties on Henley Street. The eastern one is the thing today that we know as the wool shop, and the western property is the thing that we can know as the birthplace. Collectively, we see both of them really as Shakespeare's birthplace on Henley Street, the Shakespeare's birthplace trust. But they were 2 separate properties, and it's only later in John's life that he knocks through adjoining walls and turns them completely into one property. But nevertheless, in 1556, he is a fairly wealthy man, it would seem. He is moving and shaking. He is buying property. He is buying property and land as well. At this point, no one knows when John was born. There's no birth certificate for John or birth record of him. It's likely to be that he was born around about 1530-ish, something like that, from various other records that scholars can look at, which makes him at this point about 26. So he's in his late 20s at this point and doing really well for himself. Soon after he makes these purchases, either in 56 or in 57, he marries. And he marries a young lady called Mary Arden. Now you could say that John was putting ambition first before settling down. That's a trait that you could argue that his son begins to follow. He puts family second, but you could also argue that John is being incredibly conscientious and that he's not wanting to start a family, get married until he's become a secure, dependable man who can support his family. And remember, family is so important; it's at the center of everything. And you could say, like I said, the same for his son. He put family first. He's always sending money back to Stratford. He's always buying land in Stratford. But also, you could say he leaves the family and goes off to London. So we'll never know what they were really thinking, of course. Now, who's Mary? Who's Shakespeare's mum? Well, she was raised about 4 miles outside of Stratford in a little village called Wilmcote in the parish of Aston Cantler. She was born about 10 years later than John. She's about 10 years younger than him, so around about 1540, and she's the youngest of 8 daughters. And in 1556, she is the only unmarried one. All of her siblings are either married or in service. Her father, Robert Arden, he dies the same year as she gets married. And in this year 1556, in the year of his will, the year he dies, Mary is listed as one of the 2 executors of the will, and he's built up quite a sizable fortune. He's got £77. He's got property, livestock, and I find quite fascinating. Also mentioned in his will is the bacon in the roof. So clearly a very important thing to be looking after, your bacon in the roof, to be put in a will. But she was left as part of her inheritance was 135 acres of land, the 55-foot longhouse and outbuilding known as abbeys, as well as 10 marks. Now, 10 marks was £6, 13 shillings and fourpence. And in many ways, you could say she was a modern woman of independent means. But in this period, women were seldom named in wills, and we can infer perhaps something from this. You could say that Mary possibly had been educated to a certain extent. We don't know to what extent. Robert Arden had been a widow. He'd been a widow and he remarried. She could possibly read. She could possibly write, as well as maybe having a head for figures. As the youngest daughter at home, she would have been helping her father to a certain extent to look after the property and the work on the farm at Wilmcote. Park Honan, the historian in his book Shakespeare A Life, he mentions that there's been an analysis of her mark, so not necessarily her signature, but her mark on a deed, on a property deed that she signs in 1579, which suggests that she was able to use a quill and possibly write with one. Writing is a specialist skill. Reading less more so. But writing is a specialist skill. So for someone who possibly has not had any formal education, being able to write certain things, you would say that's quite an achievement in this period. Germaine Greer, in her brilliant book, Shakespeare's Wife, a fascinating book, argues that because she's named in the will, though, doesn't make her any more able. Purely, it may have been practical. Her other siblings, as I say, were married, in service, and she was the only person still at home. So the only person to inherit all of this stuff is Mary. The will may also have been being drawn up during pre-marriage negotiations between the Shakespeares and the Ardens, and the 10 marks may well represent her dowry. But before he died, her father Robert was John's father's landlord at Snitterfield. So there were close connections between these 2 families already. So perhaps that's how John and Mary met, through those connections. We'll never really know how they met. We have no record of their courtship. There is no balcony scene. Um, we can only presume and imagine what the courtship was like. But in the final year of Bloody Mary, Bloody Catholic Queen Mary's reign, in 1556, John and Mary tie the knot. John is a justice of the peace, a borough councillor, and a successful businessman. And his wife is an heiress to a modest fortune. She's possibly educated, and she has heritage. The Ardens could stretch their name back through centuries. And of course, the area around Stratford, the Forest of Arden, is linked to them. It's suspected that they were married in the church in Aston Cantlow. He's about 26, 27. She's about 16, 17. The average for a marriage at that time is 28 for a man, 26 for a woman. Though remember, Mary is the youngest daughter, and there is nobody else at home. So this is possibly why she marries at this point. Just interesting to note women's legal status second in Elizabethan England. It was very, very, very different. Women were seen, well, their legal status was subservient to men, and certainly their fathers and their husbands. All property, goods, money would transfer basically from the father to the daughter, husband, upon marriage. I mean, the accounts that you hear of many marriages, I mean, maybe because these are the ones that are recorded, a man could legally beat his wife like he would a traitor, a pagan, a servant, and wives were given scolding bridles. So if you had a wife who you thought was talking too much, you could actually fit her with a metal bridle to stop her from talking. And there are carved, they're called misericords, and they are these wooden benches in church that you can pull down, and there's some in Holy Trinity Stratford, and you'll see them all over the UK. You pull them down to sit on, and if you flip them up, they've got stories, like allegorical stories. So it could be the Green Man, it could be George and the Dragon, but there are ones. There's one in Holy Trinity Stratford of a woman with a bridle. There's also one with a woman hitting a man, presumably we think a husband, with a frying pan. I don't know what those particular references are, but those were, they were very they were facts about married life. Your wife, the wife was not allowed to allow non-family visitors into the house without the husband's permission. So in many ways, you could say, well, God, this is, it sounds incredibly draconian. But also, in this period, the position of marriage also meant that the wife gained power. Now, today, we wouldn't see this as power. In a way, she became the husband's deputy. So while he was away at work, at business, or whatever, she controlled everything in the house. She controlled the finances. She controlled tradesmen. She controlled the servants. And although it sounds incredibly backward to us today, this was the natural order of things, and no one questioned it. So when you're watching a play, you have to bear some of these things in mind. So when you've got how exceptional characters like Beatrice, who's refusing to marry, or Rosalind, who tells Orlando what it is to woo a man, Hermia, who refuses her father's decision to get married. There's quite huge concepts that Shakespeare's putting on stage in these what we now see as championing as these wonderfully modern heroines. But we have no knowledge of whether theirs was a happy marriage or not. We have no idea whether Mary eating with a frying pan. We have no idea whether she had to wear a scolding bridle, because there's no written evidence either way. Germaine Greer suggests that Mary may well have been very happy to have left the farming life behind and go and live with the townspeople. Certainly marrying a successful businessman who sits on the council would have given Mary an elevated status within the town, or servants with it, and would have she'd have new friends of equal status. There's a Flemish historian called Emmanuel van Meteren. He was a historian and a consul too in London. And in 1575, he described such English townswomen as this. I'll read it to you. All the rest of the time, they employ visiting friends and keeping company, conversing with their equals, whom they term gossips, and their neighbours, and making merry with them at childbirths, christenings, churchings, and funerals. In fact, he goes as far to say that England is the paradise of women. Now, this may seem fairly fanciful, but when we examine some of the dialogue in Shakespeare's plays, especially his finest domestic comedy, The Merry Wives of Windsor, these women begin to sort of come to life. So here's a little extract from Mistress Ford and Mistress Page. Mistress Page, trust me, I was going to your house. Trust me, I was going to you. You look very ill. Oh, Mistress Page, give me some counsel. What's the matter, woman? Oh, woman, if it were not for one trifling respect, I could come to such an honour. Hang the trifle, woman, take the honour. What is it? Dispense with trifles. What is it? Wonderful domestic gossip going on there. I love the idea that Shakespeare might have created the Merry Wives, these two women, from a memory of his mother and the gossips on the doorstep, finding out about what's going on around the corner. So, although we don't know if this was a loving marriage, we do know, though, for the first 8 years of their married life together, they had to weather some very big storms. They had two daughters, Joan in 1558 and Margaret in 1562, who both died in infancy. They had a third daughter, in fact, Anne, who was born much later in 1578. She died at the age of 7. Infant mortality was incredibly high in Elizabethan England, and only a third of babies survived their first year. So it would be a moment of mixed emotions when a son comes along in 1564. Joy for a new baby, joy for a boy to carry on the Shakespeare name, but also joy tinged with the fear for survival. And that was highlighted even more only 3 to 4 months later. On the 11th of July, 1564, it is noted in the Stratford Parish Register, hic incepit. Here begins the plague. And the plague visited Stratford for the whole of the summer in 1564. Thomas Deeg in Ely Street, just 300 yards away from the house in Henley Street, lost first an apprentice and then his wife, Joan. A few doors down from the Shakespeares, the Greenaways, those merchants I talked about, they lost 4 children. And by September the 1st, 1 out of 15 in the parish had been infected. The plague did leave town at the end of the year, but it took 1/6 of the town with it. And in this current crisis that we're living through here, you can really feel how precious Mary and John must have felt about their only son, especially after losing 2 previous children. But hope is there because, despite all of those odds, Will survives. We don't know how he survived it. Most books comment on the devotion, the love, and the attention surely showered upon their only son, the emotional pressure that Mary must have felt to keep William alive. Is an emotional bond, that would never leave mother and child. One suggestion is that she took him to the old Ardham farm in Wilmcote. But you can counter that argument was because John was a member of the town council. He was on the front line, fighting this plague, that he would suggest that the Shakespeares had to stay in town. But either way, for the first 30 months of his life, Will is the centre of attention for both parents. And their son later writes in sonnet number 25, "Then happy I that love and am beloved, where I may not remove nor be removed." Mothers in Shakespeare are commonly strong, stable, guiding roles such as Volumnia in Coriolanus, Lady Macduff, Richard in sorry, not Richard, Elizabeth in Richard III with her two princes, Hermione and Paulina in The Winter's Tale. Constance in King John, though not perhaps as strong and stable as some of these, delivers what sounds like an all too personal account of what it must be like to lose a son, and it's her son, Prince Arthur, in this case. Grief fills up the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me. O Lord, my boy, my son Arthur, my fair son. So it goes on, this speech. This may have echoes back to Will's own loss, of course, of his own son who dies in 1595, but you can hear a mother's words to her infant son lodged in the memory of the writer. So before we carry on with our story, I realise that we're about, goodness, we are far into this evening's talk and still got a little bit to go yet. We should address the date of his birth. The date of 23rd of April is completely conjecture. We have no evidence at all. There is no birth certificate, there is no birth record, nothing, unless it comes to light in the future. We know he was baptized on the 26th of April, and that medieval Tudor babies, they are usually baptized within 5 days of their birth. So we've got a window between the 21st and the 26th of April when he could have been baptized. One story was that was first suggested was by the bibliographer William Aldies in the mid 1700s, and that it was the 23rd of April, plucks it from somewhere. George Stephens, who's an early Shakespearean editor, he edits a version of Shakespeare's plays with Samuel Johnson. He in 1773 suggests that as it not only conveniently conflicts with the day he died, but also patriotically coincides with St. George's Day, England's patron saint. Now, in another book you'll read, Clark Honan's Shakespeare's Life, comments that surely, though, if the boy had been born on this saint's day, England's patron saint, surely something would have been made of that during his lifetime or just after he died, or certainly within 100 years of his death, but there isn't. One interesting thought, though, is that his granddaughter, Elizabeth, she marries on the 22nd of April, 1626, 10 years after he passes away. So could that date have been symbolic for the family? Could the 22nd be the day he was born and they only knew it within the household? We'll never know. Of course, we'll never know when he was born, but we'll stick with the 23rd because we rather like the 23rd. So we'll stick with that. So after Will's birth, the future of the Shakespeares continues to rise. In 56, John is made an alderman, complete with an alderman's ring, perhaps with an agate stone no bigger than Queen Mab on it, which Mercutio talks about in Romeo and Juliet. 2 years later, he's nominated as a bailiff or mayor of Stratford, but he initially declines this. But then when he's voted again the following year, he accepts. And so at the age of 4.5, Will sees his dad at the pinnacle of his career, not only of his career, but also of civic life in town. You know, wearing his fur robes and his chain for official days, sergeants with maces would have come to the house to escort him to the guild chamber. Such a spectacle would have made a huge impression on a 5-year-old. As bailiff, John was also justice of the peace, which meant he would confer with the lord of the manor. He would continue both as a bailiff and deputy bailiff and a justice of the peace in 1571 and 72. In his maiden speech as bailiff, he refers to the council or the corporation as their fishing as a brotherhood and a brethren. So John was clearly proud of this civic role he had in the life of his town and felt strongly about the community that he served, in which he lived. And close ties and support were really important to him. And it would seem really well placed because he's going to really need them in about 8 years' time. Anyway, Through his civic duties and Mary's friendships with similar families, the Shakespeare's household would have got to know every walk of life in Stratford, from civic authorities to ploughhands, from visiting government clerks to weavers, tailors, bellow menders, joiners. The whole cast of the rude mechanicals from A Midsummer Night's Dream would have been coming through the Shakespeare's door for a chat, maybe some question or some. I find it fascinating when you think about that, about those bits about Shakespeare's plays that turn up in his life, or his life that turns up in his plays. And there's a number of constables as well. John was a constable. Constables that turn up in Shakespeare's plays. To be fair, the constables are usually pretty dim-witted. They're not the best. Dogberry, Elbow, Dull. I mean, that's his name. They're pretty ineffectual. Here's Dogberry. I'm a wise fellow, and which is more an officer, and which is more a householder, and which is more as pretty a piece of flesh as any in Messina, and one that knows the law go to, and a rich fellow enough go to, and a fellow that hath had losses, and one that hath 2 gowns, and everything handsome about him. There's a little bit of John in there somewhere, I can detect. In the preceding action, just before this speech, Dogberry calls on the watch to take away the braggarts Borachio and Conrad, who they've caught. And Conrad says, "Off, coxcomb." Dogberry says, "God's my life, where's the sexton? Let him write down the prince's officer coxcomb. Come bind them, you naughty varlet. Away, you are an ass, you are an ass. Dost thou not suspect my place? Dost thou suspect my years? Oh, that he had been here to write me down an ass." The Act of Books for Stratford Parish notes a number of bawdy law cases, and here's a couple which just again have ringing sort of mirror images to some of that. Elizabeth Wheeler is recorded as saying in court, "God's wounds, a plague on you all, and a fart on your ass for you." Nice. She was excommunicated from the town. And then there's a Richard Wheeler who's on trial for calling the wife of Richard Brooks whore and sow like whore, and with divers other filthy speeches. Now he's made to go to church the following Sunday and stand in the pulpit for the whole of morning prayer so everyone could see him. And that's not really different from the penance that Claudio has to go and undertake in Much Ado About Nothing for slandering Hero, to sing hymns and prayers to her epitaph through the night. But it's at this point in the Shakespeare's life that the story begins to go a bit wrong for John. The 1570s saw inflation and prices rise, wages sink, and despite amassing a very sizable portfolio, just to go through some of it, he's got interest in 100 acres at Snitterfield, 14 acres at Ingan Meadow, 22 acres of meadow and pasture, the Land and Croft in Greenfield Street, another property purchase in 1575 of £40, and not to mention the gloving business, and being in a position where he could actually loan the council money, which he does. But within 10 years, John is going to lose all of this, or pretty much all of it. In 1570, he's fined again, this time for breaking usury laws by charging high interest, £20 on a sum of 80 and another sum of £100. Usury was against the law in England. Only those outside of Christianity could charge interest on loans, such as Jews, hence the central theme of The Merchant of Venice. However, it seems that this was passed over by the authorities, but 2 years later, in 1572, he's twice accused of illegal wool dealing. This is when things begin to hot up. And naturally, as part of being a widower and a glover, there would be plenty of leftovers, fleeces and stuff hanging about, and someone can make a bid on the side, But John went further than that. It would seem that he was operating without a license from the wool staple in London. The wool staple was like the wool merchants' headquarters in London, and they issued you legal licenses to trade. He had interest in grazing rights in Nottinghamshire, Banbury, and Marlborough. And it would also, all of these things would begin to indicate that perhaps he's working as a freelance wool dealer, an illegal wool dealer known as a brogger. Now, in winter of 1576, things come to a head. Wool shortages are starting to be blamed on these broggers, that they are holding wool back in order to see the price of it increase. So the Privy Council order that all wool buyers, legal wool buyers, are called in for questioning, and they are temporarily closed down, thus to try and wheedle out the illegal wool buyers, the broggers. Now, this meant double trouble for John, because questioning by the Privy Council would also include questions of religion. Earlier in 1576, Elizabeth appoints a Grand Commission to examine offences into the Act of Supremacy in 1559. Remember, I mentioned that last week, where everybody basically had to swear an oath to the Queen, Elizabeth, as head of the Church of England. That she was the head and not the Pope. Now, until now, her and her government had not made windows into men's souls, as she famously said. Rome was stepping up its attempts to reintroduce Catholicism back into England. The government began to clamp down. Now, in Stratford, at the beginning of 1577, this is January 23rd, John does not turn up on election day. Fine for not doing so is excused. In the same year, he's excused from making a poor relief payment. And when all those are in civic office are called to take an oath of allegiance, John is also absent. A levy is called to strengthen the militia, and John is ordered to pay the lower rate of 3 shillings 4pence. He's again excused, and it remains unpaid for a year. By 1580, he's fined again, this time for £40, and called to London when he doesn't take part in a military commission to log and recruit suitable fighting men. Remember, a war potentially with Spain is coming. Now, that fine of £40 is the amount that John raised only a couple of years earlier by selling the property in Wilmcote that they had purchased, and that Wilmcote property was part of Mary's inheritance. So you get the sense that John is hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. That money is also including his wife and his children's inheritance, as well as dodging as many bullets as possible of turning up at public civic council events. In fact, he doesn't appear at any council events for 9 years, except once to vote for his friend Hamlet Sadler. Now, true, as again Germaine Greer points out in her book, that this wasn't just John. There was a lot of people. In the 1580s, the Midlands was in the midst of a recession in the wool trade, and all other John's business contacts therefore would have been in the same boat. But it's interesting, I think, to consider what his son later writes about ambition. In Henry IV, Part 2, Humphrey of Gloucester says, "Virtue is choked with foul ambition, and charity chased hence with rancor's head." Macbeth, Ross says to Macduff in Macbeth, "Thriftless ambition that will raven up thine own life's means." There's a religious connection to a lot of this as well, which we won't go into tonight, and I'll come back to that in a later episode. But the reason also John is starting to duck out of certain things as well and not take an oath of allegiance and certain looking for his creditors and things is a question over John's religion. Is John still in the old faith? Is he still a Catholic? It's very possible that he was. I see, Jane, you just asked a question earlier about was he a Catholic. It's very possible that he and Mary still were in their hearts and in their minds. Outwardly, they may very well have been Protestant Church of England, but in their hearts, who knows? There's a pamphlet found. There was a pamphlet found in the rafters of the birthplace in the 1753. I want to say, but maybe it was later than that, 1780s. It's a pamphlet that basically has John's signature in it, or John's mark in it. And these pamphlets were brought into England by Jesuits, Roman Catholic spies, if you like, who were trying to whip up support for Catholicism, and they were printed and disseminated. And the fact that it's in the eaves of the birthplace and it was got John's mark in it, might suggest that he was still adhering to the old faith. A lot of the people of his friends, close friends, are also people who end up with fines for recusancy. His daughter, Shakespeare's daughter, is fined for recusancy at some point in her life, Susanna. So the religion is, I said last week, we can't begin to imagine the importance of the question of religion in our modern secular society. It pervades everything. So by 1580, Will is 16 years old, and he's seen his father go from hero to zero. That's got to make a lasting impression. We'll never know what he really thought, of course, but a loss of status would have had its impact not only on the family, but on the eldest son, future prospects. Now, what had Will been doing in those 16 years? Well, that's going to be the topic for next week's episode. We're going to look at Shakespeare's education. What would he have been doing? The world around him, the education he would have got from his mother, from his family, from the world outside of the birthplace, and also the education we think he may have had at the grammar school where he was sent because his father sat on the council. An education perhaps that was terminated early because of some of these things that John got involved with. But that's next week, and we've run over by 15 minutes. My goodness. I hope that hasn't kept any of you from watching important soap operas. If anybody has any questions, you can. I'll try and I'll have a little quick look through. I don't think anyone's asked any questions tonight. Jane, I've asked your question. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful. If you do have any questions, please you can email them to my email address at GSC. It's Matt at and then Guildford-Shakespeare-company.co.uk, or go on the website, look at our team, and have a little look. Yes, Ian, you should check up your family heritage. You never know. Sadler, I reckon there's something to do with horses in there somewhere. It's got to be. The Sadlers were they were neighbours. Judith and Hamlet Sadler. Shakespeare named his two twins after them. So you could, who knows? You can have a link. You can have a link. In. Have a look, folks. It's been fascinating once again. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope we'll see you all next week. If you want to watch this again, it will be on YouTube tomorrow, and we'll pass it on to your friends. It'd be lovely to have more of you along if you are free. Take care of yourselves, folks. Look after yourselves. Keep safe. Stay at home. Protect everybody, and we'll see you next week. Look after yourselves. Bye bye.